everyone, thanks for joining me for this video on Allan Holdsworth's history with the SynthAxe. So when I bought mine, I wanted to just do some research and look online and see what Allan had said, how he got it, and I found a ton of great information, so I thought it would be nice to put it all in one video, like those 5-watt world videos if you've seen them. It's just that this video is not going to be nearly as professional or slick, and this is a different kind of video that I'm going to make, so this is probably the only one that I'm going to do that's like this. So I want to thank the Allan Holdsworth Archives, because pretty much this entire video was I got from quotes of Allan in publications and interviews, and the Allan Holdsworth Archives has a ton of them archived. You could just type in a word, and I just typed in SynthAxe and was able to sort of build the history, what Allan said, and some time frames and stuff like that. I also want to thank Steve Hunt and Eddie Coralnick, because there were a couple of questions that I had when gathering information that they gave me directly. So without that, I would not have gotten to the bottom of a couple of little weird things that I found that Allan didn't really talk about. So there's going to be a ton of quotes at the end, but the main bulk of the video I'll have and the important ones. So if you want to skip to the end, you can see all the quotes that I was going to use straight from Allan and from the Allan Holdsworth Archives. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this video.
The SynthAxe is a fretted guitar-like MIDI controller used to control synths like how a keyboard does. It does not make any sound itself and needs to be connected to a synth in order to produce sound. It was created by Bill Aitken, Mike Dixon, and Tony Sedevi and manufactured in England. Bill was the main designer of the SynthAxe, who worked for the BBC from 1970 to 1980, as well as doing sales and marketing for Solid State Logic. He had first had the idea in 1977, and they started development in 1980. In 1982, they were able to persuade Richard Branson of Virgin to invest in it for research and development. And along the way, they were aided in the design by Ian Dampney and Ken Steele to try to solve the problems of finding the optimum layout of the instrument while balancing physical and musical requirements with its mechanical constraints and weight distribution. Interestingly, the SynthAxe was first designed to be used with the Farlight CMI synthesizer, but in October of 1982, MIDI technology was first introduced in Keyboard magazine by Robert Moog. The SynthAxe company then had to quickly integrate it into their product, as it would soon be the standard for communication between electronic musical instruments. In 1985, it was first commercially available. Although never publicly admitted, each SynthAxe was practically a prototype, as every single one was handmade and made to order. When finally released, they cost £10,000 or $13,000, eventually reduced to £6,000. Adjusted for inflation, it would be $35,000 today. Allan had tried some of the Roland synth guitars like the GS300 and 500 series and wasn't impressed by them because of their limitations. Since they were converting the guitar's pitched voltage to drive the synths, there were a number of track problems. Allan felt like he was fighting the instrument. I believe he had used one of these guitars for a guest solo on a Scenario 2 off of Gong's 1979 record Time is the Key, and although the exact model is unknown, he apparently also used one for In the Mystery off of the Metal Fatigue album. Allan saw an ad or advertisement for the SynthAxe in 1984 and called Guitar Player magazine associate editor Tom Mulhern if he had heard any information on it. Through Tom, Allan was able to get in touch with the designer of the SynthAxe, Bill Aitken. Bill was going to be at the Winter NAMM show from February 1st to 3rd, 1985, which has taken place in Anaheim, California since 1979. A week before the show, Bill would be using some spare space at Oberheim so some of the notable guitarists in the area could try the SynthAxe. That's where Allan first tried it and fell in love with it. What he loved was the instrument didn't make any mistakes, only the player made them. He felt completely free with anything he would want to do. His major attraction to it, though, was that he was able to create the sounds he had heard in his head and use the SynthAxe to achieve that, instead of being limited to just pickups and distortion on a guitar. So he had used all the strengths that the SynthAxe had in order to develop his compositions. For example, turning the left-hand dampening feature off to blend chords impossible to play on the guitar, or using the keys on the SynthAxe to swell in chords. He also used a Krumar Steiner Master Touch breath controller to control the dynamics of the notes during solos, similar to a horn player. Because Allan was so enthusiastic for the SynthAxe, Bill let him demo it at that NAMM show. He was amazed that Allan was able to use the instrument so quickly and seemed to create a new tune instantly from it. But the truth is, Allan had already been experimenting. Since he had played the violin, he wanted to experiment with fifths tuning. A violin is tuned in fifths from G, D, A, E. Allan started using 5-string guitars, adding a low C to that tuning, add to its range. Eventually using this tuning for a solo also on In the Mystery for Metal Fatigue, and on other tracks like John St. James's Fast Impressions and Rainy Taxi. From this interview, Allan tells Bill that what he had played that impressed Bill so much was actually a piece he had just finished writing and was hoping to record on his next record. Judging from this info, it was most likely Looking Glass he had played, since Allan says the first section was in fifths, as well as the chords never using the low 6th string, which would be in F. As much as Allan loved the instrument, the only thing he didn't like was the length of the neck. He wanted to make it 21% smaller. He worked with Alex Stansfield on how that would work, balancing the electronics in the neck to fit properly. He mentioned that some of the chords he would play high on the neck are now impossible on the SynthAxe neck. But despite talking about this in multiple interviews, as well as asking other SynthAxe players if they would be interested in it, it didn't seem to be cost viable and never came to fruition until about 1992, just before the company folded. SynthAxe Company was working with Akai on a Mark II prototype with a smaller neck and a 2-space rack unit that held the floor pedal and console information. Even though they made the neck smaller, it was still having issues with errant notes. They apparently only made 2 prototypes. Akai owns one, and the other is owned by Mal Chapman, who worked for SynthAxe. So after the Winter NAMM demo, Allan had ordered a SynthAxe. Bill states that because of how they were made, they weren't fully ready for production, so it would take some time before Allan would get one. There's a bit of a rumor that Allan had to sell or mortgage his house to afford the SynthAxe. This isn't exactly true. Allan had kept a home in England after moving to the States in case he didn't like it and wanted to move back. He had leased the house, but the tenant didn't pay. And being a musician, it was already enough of a struggle paying for one home, so he had sold the one in England somewhat unwillingly. He got more than what he had originally paid and used that money to buy the SynthAxe. In the meantime, Allan also purchased an Oberheim expander from his experience using one at Oberheim's location. I believe the Oberheim Matrix 12, an upgraded expander, debuted at that February '85 NAMM show. The expander has no keys, so the only way to control it is to hook it up to a keyboard or a SynthAxe. Since Allan didn't care to learn to play the keyboards, he tried learning how to use it by reading the manual, but getting nowhere because he didn't know what it would sound like. Only to when he got the SynthAxe, he was able to understand what everything did and started creating his own patches. A couple of months later, he finally got his first SynthAxe, which was a green one, presumably in late March of 1985 after his tour of Japan that ended on the 18th. He waited until he got the SynthAxe before writing any new material. He's alluded to that Non-Brew Condiment was the first piece that he wrote on it. Atavachron, All Our Yesterdays, The Dominant Plague, and the middle part of Mr. Burwell were probably written in that time. Funnels was already written a year earlier for the Queen Mary Jazz Festival, which occurred in April of 1985, even though it wasn't played. Allan also experiments using his volume pedal and harmonizers with the SynthAxe. The chords at the end of All Our Yesterdays uses a harmonizer an octave higher on it, as well as using the volume pedal to swell in the chords in the middle section. There isn't a lot of information available after March of 1985. It's assumed Allan spent the months from April to October recording, writing, purchasing gear, setting up the SynthAxe, learning how to use the synthesizers, etc. At a show in November of 1985 while supporting Al Di Meola, Allan states that he finished the record 2 weeks earlier, so approximately Atavachron was finished in late October. After recording Atavachron and touring with Al Di Meola, the first time Allan uses the SynthAxe live is at the Frankfurt Jazz Festival that occurred on February 16, 1986 in Germany, and also on the subsequent short European tour afterwards. The Frankfurt show is also available on DVD. On the DVD, you can see Allan fumbling a little bit with the SynthAxe console. This is because at the time, the foot switch wasn't available. Also, the firmware that included a song set feature that allowed you to cycle through your saved banks wasn't implemented, so all patch changes had to be done by hand. Another reason why he had such difficulty was because of the display screen. It looks like an old calculator and isn't backlit, so it's possible to mess up because you simply can't see what you're looking at. The main synths that Allan used for touring from 1986 to 1989 was an Oberheim expander, an Oberheim Matrix 12, and a Yamaha TX7. The Oberheim Matrix 12 and the expanders are practically identical, except for the fact that the Matrix 12 has a keyboard which Allan sawed off. I believe Chad Wackerman owns this one now. Also, the Matrix 12 has double the amount of voices of the Expander, which had 6. The Yamaha TX7 was identical to the Yamaha DX7, except it didn't have a keyboard. Also, it could not be programmed directly like you could on a DX7. You needed to use Steinberg's SynthWorks in order to create the patches.
This is my old Atari. I have 2 of them. I actually have 4 of them. But I have 2 of them right here. This was running the DX7 program SynthWorks because I love DX7s.
Allan also has mentioned about using a Kurzweil 250 expander, but only for a couple of things. He specifically mentions using it for his solo on Sand, as well as mixing it with an Oberheim expander. They did play Sand live, but I doubt that he brought the Kurzweil on tour. There aren't a lot of photos that show Allan's rig, but every time I've seen a photo that includes the SynthAxe console, it only shows 3 MIDI ports being used. I would assume those MIDI ports were for both Oberheims and the TX7. Adding the Kurzweil would just be another large piece of gear to tour with that would only be used for just a couple of things, so I would suspect that it wasn't used live. The Kurzweil 250 expander was the same as the Kurzweil 250, just without a keyboard, similar to the way that the Oberheim expander is to the Matrix 12. The 250 was introduced at the June 1983 NAMM show in Chicago. It was at the time £15,000 or $18,000. The expander was released in 1985 for £8,000 or $10,000. One great thing about the Oberheims, which makes transcribing Allan's music difficult, is that each of the 6 voices on the expander could be assigned to 1 string on the SynthAxe, and with the Matrix 12, it could be 2 voices per string. You can even pan those 2 voices in the stereo image, so this makes synth layering really easy to get these great fat sounds, but because there's so many variables, it's really tough to know what's really going on. At the time, the expanders were about $4,000 when released in 1984, which adjusting for inflation would be $11,600 today. The Matrix 12s came out a year later and were about $6,400 and adjusting for inflation $18,000 today, and both were produced until 1988. The Yamaha DX7s were produced from 1983 to 1986 and cost about $2,000 or $6,000 today. The TX7s were released in 1985 and were a little over $900 or $2,500 today. When Allan returned from his European tour in February of 1986, he was able to swap his green SynthAxe with a newer gray one, as well as a new console with the latest firmware, which included that song set feature. Allan started using that gray SynthAxe for his US tour in April of 1986, and it was his main SynthAxe that he used live until 1989. Also for that April of '86 tour, he started using the breath controller live. The Yamaha DX7 or TX7s are very dynamic, so I believe that the breath controller was most likely used for those patches. Now there are actually 2 types of SynthAxes. The green one that Allan first got and uses it on the DVD was the first generation. There are only a few small external differences between the first and second generation SynthAxes. On the first gens, they use switches instead of buttons for the left-hand trigger functions. The trigger switch near the trigger strings is also much higher up than in the middle of the second generation. The tremolo bar is also completely straight instead of bent, and apparently they broke often because of this design. Also, instead of using screws, the cover for the trigger strings and the bottom of the neck were Velcro. The headstock logo was also molded into the plastic instead of it being glued onto it, but the biggest difference was internal. Because of its design, the trigger strings and keys weren't very sensitive, so some upgraded transducer chips were replaced inside the body of the SynthAxe to replace the older analog ones. One other interesting note is that Allan could not record direct MIDI with the breath controller, so all solos that use a breath controller were all mic speaker cabinets. So the splice that I've mentioned before in the solo for Spokes, where it switches from fifths to standard tuning, was most likely 2 separate takes, which leads me to believe that a lot of the tunes that use multiple tunings for the solo were either a bunch of different takes with those different tunings edited together, or done line by line. After the 1986 European and US tour with Kai Akagi on keyboards, Allan went back out on tour later in the year, opening up for Chick Corea, but only as a 3-piece band without any keys. In order to fill out the SynthAxe tunes a bit, the band had to play along with backing tracks during Allan's solos for Non-Brew Condiment, Looking Glass, Podwad, and Distance First Desire. the band hated using the backing tracks because it was restrictive not only with the tempos, but also how many solos you can take. Allan then went on a European tour in the spring of 1987, opening up for Stanley Clarke, again as a three-piece, but now with Bob Wackerman on bass. So they were still using the backing tracks. Eventually, Allan asked the keyboard player for Stanley's band, Steve Hunt, if he wanted to help them out, and he agreed. Steve then joined the band and went back out on tour with them for a US tour starting in September of 1987 and stayed with the band until 1995. By 1989, Allan had two SynthAxes, a gray and a red one. The red one may have been a spare, and there isn't a lot of photographic evidence of it being used live, except for a UK tour in November and December of 1989. The red one also may have been purchased in 1987. It's also probable that in order to cut down on costs and shipping issues, the red one was left outside the US and used for Pacific and European tours. Allan also had 4 consoles, 2 for each SynthAxe. Sometime in 1986, you can buy some of the parts individually, as in just a SynthAxe for a spare or an extra console. Of the 4 consoles, 2 worked and even they had issues. Console memory issues while touring in Japan in April and May of 1989 made him just want to quit the SynthAxe entirely. The SynthAxe was last used live in March of 1990. By his tour of the Pacific Rim in May, Allan had already adapted the tunes that needed fifths tuning on the SynthAxe, most notably Non-Brew Condiment and Looking Glass, to a double-neck Steinberger, which he really didn't like. The live record then was recorded over a few days in Japan during this tour. Allan stopped using the SynthAxes live for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was just for how fragile they were. If something went wrong, he couldn't play half the set. The other was the cost of transporting it. Transporting it around the world was very costly, and because it was so big and bulky, sometimes the payment from the show couldn't even cover the cost of it. From playing the SynthAxe, Allan ended up loving completely straight necks with a flat radius. So at the time when he was using Steinberger guitars in 1987, the company would send him guitars with no frets. He would then have his friend and tech build the lap, flatten the necks, and refret them. Allan had Steinberger make him a green double neck in 1989, but he didn't like it too much. Since the scale of the fifth's neck was too short, Allan tuned the low F an octave higher, otherwise it would have been too loose to play. Eventually, Bill just made him a 27-fret double neck guitar in black to replace the Steinberger double neck with the correctly pitched low F. He also went on to make regular scale and baritone guitars for him in the future. Again, by mid-1992, Allan would ditch the double neck and having to switch from a fifth's neck to a standard neck and just adapt all that material to one standard tuned guitar. Again, probably for the same reason above, traveling with a double neck could be very expensive, especially if it was only being used at the most for 3 tunes: Looking Glass, Non-Brew Condiment, and Sphere of Innocence. During his US tour in September, Allan was only using the double neck for Sphere of Innocence, which was only played for the first few shows. Around that same time, Allan got his final baritone guitar from Bill, a 29-fret, 38.2-inch scale tuned to A called Gonad. In late 1992, presumably after his US tour, Allan sold both of his SynthAxes and all of his synths after the SynthAxe company folded that year. He was still concerned with not being able to get them repaired. Interestingly, the company was still repairing them by Alex Stansfield up until 1996. It's unknown where the red one ended up, but the gray one now resides with Andre Caparazzo. But then after a few months after selling them, Allan started to realize that he really missed them. By 1993, for the record Hard Hat area, Allan used a borrowed SynthAxe and only used it for the title track and postlude. He shows interest in a keyboard/guitar hybrid controller manufactured by Star Labs, known by Star Switch until 1996. He most likely used this a little for the solo on postlude. Eventually, Allan traded 2 guitars for the SynthAxe he was borrowing, which was dark blue. It's presumed Allan traded his baritone guitars for it. Natasha, a 34-inch scale tuned to C that he used for Zarabeth, and Boris, a 36 scale tuned to B flat used for the Sphere of Innocence solo and Wardenclyffe Tower. In November of 1994, that dark blue one was stolen after a sound check. Allan mentions this to the audience at the beginning of their first show at the Catalina Bar and Grill in Los Angeles, California. According to Steve Hunt, who played keys for those shows, since the gig was so close to Allan's home, he wanted to use the SynthAxe for that weekend, which was 5 shows, 1 on Friday the 11th, 2 on Saturday, and 2 on Sunday. While loading in gear, a homeless man offered to help in exchange for money, which the band declined. They did their sound check with the SynthAxe and were going back to the hotel where the same man asked for money again. Allan then gave him what he had, which apparently was just a wad of $1 bills. The man took the money, looked at it, and then called Allan a cheapskate. When they got back to the gig and started playing, they noticed the SynthAxe was stolen, to which they assumed it was taken by the homeless man. All the synths, cables, and parts for the SynthAxe were left. Looking Glass and Pud Wood were played for those shows, which was what the SynthAxe would have been used for in the past, but they were played on standard guitar that night. It's unclear if Allan was going to play Looking Glass in fifths that night how it was originally written, or he was going to play it in standard how he was doing the past few years, just using a synth sound for that and Pud Wood. Shortly after it was stolen, Robert and Dean DeLeo from the band Stone Temple Pilots heard about the incident and bought Allan another SynthAxe, which was a light blue one. Unfortunately, this one worked intermittently and overheated after 20 minutes. Their help is the reason why they're thanked in the credits on his 1996 release, None Too Soon. About a year later, Allan got the stolen SynthAxe back after a fan found it in a pawn shop and relayed him the message. After calling the police, he ended up paying $30, which is what the store bought it for. The shop thought it was some sort of practice guitar, since it was just a controller and didn't have any of the cables or units, so there was no way to actually use or test it. The pawn shop owner logged it in his book as one plastic guitar, which Allan got quite the kick out of. By the year 2000, Allan still only had two SynthAxes, the light blue one and the dark blue one. By that time, he still hadn't gotten any more of those Oberheims and primarily only used Yamaha FM synth modules.
And you can't buy DX7s. I have a whole big rack of DX7s here, which I think are absolutely spectacular. Why Yamaha makes something and discontinues it 2 weeks later, I don't know, but they do. Anyway.
In a 2005 interview, Allan mentions both of his SynthAxes and that the cables are falling apart and he was using duct tape to fix them. Charlie, known as Spirit Nirvana on YouTube, says that Allan had offered to sell him the broken light blue SynthAxe for $1,000 that year, and that one is now in the possession of Allan's friend and roadie, Eddie Coralnick. Finally, in late 2015, Allan put up the darker blue SynthAxe for sale on Reverb for $15,000. A member of the Unreal Allan Holdsworth Facebook group said that his cousin had bought it. The last thing that I want to talk about are the tunes that Allan used for the SynthAxe live. On that European tour in February of 1986, Allan debuted new music from Atavachron, which included Looking Glass, Non-Brute Condiment, and the title track Atavachron. Pud Wood was also played on that tour, but either was not played for the Frankfurt 1986 DVD or not recorded. During the US tour of April of 1986, he was playing the same tunes, but now was incorporating the SynthAxe for his solo zone chordal improvisations, to which he developed the intro chords to Sand. He would then do some solos in fifths tuning, then back into the Sand chords, followed by some interplay with Gary Husband, leading to the intro to Pud Wood. This is the only time that I know where he used the SynthAxe for these zone improvisations instead of a regular guitar. Distance vs. Desire was added to the set around October of that year during the Al Di Meola tour with the backing track, eventually with Steve Hunt playing the chords in spring of '87. Once Steve Hunt joined the band after Sand was recorded, the title track Sand was introduced in September of 1987, but reworked without the solo chordal opening. Maid Marian, which was written by Steve Hunt, was first played around May of 1988, where Allan plays the melody and also a solo with the SynthAxe. Finally, the last new tune that the SynthAxe was used for live was for Spokes, was debuted in July, but only for a very short while playing with Chad Wackerman on drums. Once Vinny Colaiuta took over drum duty on the tour a week later, Spokes was removed from the set. The only known live recording of Spokes was July 21st, 1988, which was recorded by Phil Brown in LA.